Welcome to our final session. I have to say I've really enjoyed the way we've been able to interweave kind of discussion of the substance and process of the next political era, and now we'll kind of move on to a higher, more abstract level, I guess. In a previous session, I talked about how the kind of liberal adoration for and respect for William F. Buckley was kind of a model for how we would be able to think about governing this country together, and so we're going to model that in the next session. Fortunately, I don't have to actually do it; I can just moderate it, and we have to talk about kind of where some of the basic ideological directions of the country are going. I think we'll go first with David Frum, who's a resident fellow at the American Enterprise Institute and a former speechwriter in the Bush White House, followed by Jonathan Chait, who's a senior editor at the New Republic. These gentlemen have in common that they've both recently written books that have the phrase "con" in them. David's book is called "Comeback: Conservatism That Can Win Again," and Jonathan's book is a little simpler. It's called "The Big Con." You can stand up or
all right, thank
whatever you prefer.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you for your hospitality. The phrase "we are moving to a more abstract presentation," I think translated into plain English is "now we're moving to the people who don't know what they're talking about."
We had that before.
You are grappling here today with questions of the partisanship and post-partisanship and repartisan divide of the country. I always think, as people deal with these issues, of a wonderful cartoon that appeared many years ago in a Canadian newspaper by the Montreal Gazette. The cartoonist is a man named Terry Mosher. And the cartoon showed two tweedy academic types walking shoulder to shoulder alongside down a Montreal street in front of a giant big brick wall. And one academic type is saying to the other, so let me turn this off, "You people from Toronto do not understand the subtle complexities of the linguistic situation here in Quebec." And on the wall is written in letters 10 feet high, "Speak French or die, English dogs." So my suggestion is that what is going on in American life right now is not really all that complicated. That what we are not moving to a post-partisan era, we are not moving to a departisan era, we are moving through an era of partisan shift. That the coalition that dominated American politics in the 1970s and 1980s is shrinking, and new coalitions are out there waiting to be brought into being. And the two parties have been competing for a decade and a half, each for the opportunity to bring into being this new coalition. The current state of play on that has been tremendous lack of success for the Republican attempt, and in just about every way we can measure a movement of America away from the Republican Party, to a lesser extent away from conservative ideology. And one of the things that I think is quite fascinating, that I see at least in the numbers I've been looking at, and we were at a conference, Mark and I, yesterday, where these were presented in greater detail, is that the movement toward the Democratic Party is much faster and stronger than the movement toward liberal belief. On that last point, there's hardly been any movement at all, but the movement toward the Democratic Party as an institution is real and strong, and it raises, I think, and this is where I will end, it raises a very interesting set of possibilities for the future of American politics. What is going on? Well, through the 1990s, we saw the Republicans cashing in their success achieved in the Reagan 1980s. Michael Barone likes to point out there were more New Deal senators in the Senate in the 1950s than there were in the 1930s. And in the same way, there were more Reaganites in Congress in the 1990s than there ever had been in the 1980s. And yet, the country moved into a period of partisan stalemate. In 1992 and 1996 and 2000, the winner of the presidential election failed to clear 50% of the vote. You don't have a string of elections like that since the 1880s. It is normal for American presidents, when they win, to win quite decisively. In fact, If you look at the elections starting in 1896 and working through 1988, the winning candidate averaged 53%. When you win big. That stopped being true. In just the same way, and I would suggest for many of the same reasons, that it stopped being true in the 1880s, which is in the aftermath of a great cultural upheaval. The old majority took a long time to fade away. America had been a democratic country, capital D, before the Civil War. It was becoming a Republican Party. You had a lot of Republican 30-year-olds and a lot of Democratic 50-year-olds, and it took a while to get through to the point where you had a lot of Republican 50-year-olds and a lot of Democrats in cemeteries. In the same way, in exactly the same way, we were dealing in the 1990s with the aftershock of the 1960s and absorbing that. So there were each party struggled in various ways to try to put together a new majority coalition. One of the things that happened in the Bush administration that was the defining thing about the Bush-Rove experience was that the Bush administration was above all concerned not with achieving conservative policy success, but with reassembling a Republican political majority. This is a point I made about President Bush in the book I wrote about him in 2003, and was reflected in every experience we had in that Bush White House, where again and again and again the priority was thinking about coalition building, and the goal was, as President Bush keeps saying, his top goal was to change the Republican Party, to make it a majority party, and he had some ideas about how to do that. 9/11 exploded on these plans and created both new possibilities and new dangers. That 9/11 elevated the importance of nationalism, which is one of the core issues in the Republican Party, certainly an issue very dear to my heart. And it offered the opportunity on the basis of the Republican Party as the party of strong national defense to reassemble a new majority coalition. I won't go into now the painful details about why that didn't work, except to suggest a couple of things. One is, of course, you have to succeed, and the lack of success in Iraq has been very painful. And the second was it was very difficult for the administration to combine its nationalist views with its determination to run as open an immigration policy as it could possibly get away with. Today, the trends are moving in the Democratic direction. And we can see the shift among youngest voters is strongest, but it's among all voters. We see a decline, a collapse really in Republican Party identification with the two parties which had been equal in identification in 2002. Republican identification has now plunged all the way back to where it was in 1980. Democrats have gained the lead with the public on issues, not just traditional issues, healthcare and education, but on issues that have historically belonged to the Republican Party: ethics, competence, and taxes. Democrats have big leads on ethics and competence, and even a little bit of a lead on taxes. Now, those are generic Democrats, not actual people. They may feel differently about John McCain and Barack Obama. The open door at the end is that I stress this is not an ideological shift. It is a partisan shift. And the great swing toward the Democrats on ethics and competence tells you a lot about what is going on. And what seems to be happening, at least this is the way I see it, that most Americans are not very political, and they're certainly not very left-wing. This is a market-oriented country, and the business of America is still business. What you have here are a generation that have lived through the Bush experience, arrived at a negative assessment of the Bush administration and said, I am a moderate-minded person with a lot to lose. Probably more to lose from politics than I can ever hope to gain from politics. I believe in business. I believe in private property. I believe in a more or less, I believe for my family at least, I'm not going to judge others, in a more or less traditional conception of the family. I want moderate-minded business government that balances the books, gets things done, makes things work. I want my package there overnight. I expect that. If my coffee is not brewed to my satisfaction by the barista, I want retraining. And if there's a flood, I want the government to deal with it. Everything else in America works. The government should work too. If President Eisenhower were alive, I'd vote for him. But I can't. And that person has become, who used to be a Republican, has become a Democrat. So that is a tremendous threat to the Republican Party. But here's the tremendous opportunity for the Republican Party. Because the question is, how did I expect, I will even venture to predict, the Democrats are going to win a pretty handsome result in November of 2008. And the question will be, how do they interpret that result, and what do they do with it? Do they believe they've won an ideological majority, or do they believe they've won an opportunity to build party strength through good governance? Depending on how ambitious they are, depending on how over-ambitious they are, the possibility of an overplayed hand could do as much damage to them as underperformance has done to the Republican Party over the past 8 years. And I thank you for your attention.
Well, that was a great ending, because why don't I try to pick up from where you left off and figure out what are the problems the Democrats face, and what will the Democrats do going forward if they do win it. I'm actually less optimistic than David is pessimistic. I think it's probably a 50-50 jump ball election for the Democrats, because John McCain is a very strong candidate. But so the overarching challenge that I think Democrats are going to look at when they get into office is the state of the economy. And I'm not talking about the recession. I'm talking about the disappearance of broadly shared prosperity. And what you've had in this current economic cycle is we seem to be heading into recession right now, and American incomes, even at what looks to be the peak of this cycle, are lower than they were at the last peak, and that's really extraordinary, and that's really awful. That basically what you had was a recession when American incomes dropped, and then the recession stopped, and incomes kept falling and kept falling. And the last year they basically they were flat, and then they very tepidly started to grow, and now basically it's going to go back off the cliff again. And then, of course, you look back over the past few business cycles. What you have is, during the 90s, you did have a pretty sharp rise of incomes in the middle, even at the bottom. But you've had this explosion of wealth at the top, 1 to 10%, especially the very, very top, for 3 decades now. So that per se is not a problem. But basically, when huge amounts of the increase in standard of living are being concentrated at the very top, and you're getting little or nothing in the middle, that's the basic problem that Democrats are going to need to address. And of course, I wouldn't blame George W. Bush for the problems of the current business cycle. His tax policies made it worse. They made the country less equal. They expanded income inequality. That's clear. But the underlying problems of the economy, I think are probably not his fault. But Democrats are going to have to figure out how they can use government in a way that doesn't threaten growth, but restores some kind of shared growth and prosperity. So what the big thing they've got going for them, and here I disagree with David. And I didn't bring data with me, but I was looking at a lot of the data when I did my book, The Big Con, and that you have been seeing the public moving left, and it's been moving left since the late 90s, and all these questions about the role of government. There are certain questions that are asked by pollsters, and they are over time. So this is a good measure. Questions like, would you rather have a bigger government with more services and a smaller government with fewer services? About healthcare. There was a poll recently where there was plurality support for socialized medicine described that way, and I've never seen that before. All these measures. Would you be willing to pay more money for healthcare? It's all moving up. Canceling out the tax cuts. So all these things that you've seen over time are moving to the left. So there is a base of public opinion that's very, very favorable for the Democrats. But there are problems and handicaps that the Democrats are going to be looking at. Getting into office with a public mandate and public support is not going to be enough. The Democrats had that in 1993, and that's actually it was in '93. You had a pretty sharp rightward turn in public opinion, but they did have that base of support, and not to the same extent you have now, but it went very badly. So what are the structural problems the Democrats face? You've got the makeup of Congress. You've got the House, which is kind of structurally tilted towards Republicans slightly. Part of it is gerrymandering, and probably a bigger part is that Democrats tend to live in cities and they're close together, so you have a lot of Democratic districts where they're 80%, 90% Democrats, and Republicans are more spread out, so Republican majority districts tend to be more in the 55%, 60%, and that's just, so part of it is created and part of it is just natural and probably unavoidable. The Senate is even worse. You've got the disproportionate representation of people who live in small states, which tend to be Republican. And then you've got the filibuster, because, of course, any social or economic legislation is going to have to get 60 votes. So when you combine that with the disproportionate representation of the Republican states in the Senate, you have a huge hurdle that the Democrats are going to have to clear. You basically have a very small percentage of the population and their representatives in the Senate would be able to block anything they want to. And, this is you've already started to see this with Democratic control of the Senate. An explosion of the use of the filibuster, and of course that would continue if the Democrats had the White House, and even with all three, the Senate, the House, and the White House, it's really nothing like real strong control. And then I think what's even more problematic for the Democrats is the role of the business lobbies. Because basically you have most Republicans in a very, very strong, anti-government mood. Even now, despite what the public thinks, they're unwilling to consider, with some exceptions, they're unwilling to consider any raise in taxes, especially on businesses and especially on wealthy individuals. And on top of that, you've got the problem with Democrats. Basically, every Democrat feels it's their right or even their prerogative to basically be a shill for their home state industry. So you basically have, on almost any issue, there's at least some business that's directly affected by it that's going to complain. So, there was this really egregious a tax loophole on private equity that Democrats were trying to close. And of course, every Republican was opposed to this loophole close, as was people like Chuck Schumer, because he represents Wall Street, so he feels that he should represent his people. I mean, it's a tiny share of his people, but it's but on every issue, right? If you wanted to do something about the agricultural subsidies to people at high incomes, Blanche Lincoln and the other Southern Democrats are going to raise a fuss. So basically, you combine this with what I was saying about the disproportionate representation in the Senate and the threat of the filibuster. You're going to have a coalition of almost all the Republicans, plus any Democrat whose home state industry is affected by whatever change you're talking about, and you're going to have a really, really tough opposition that you're not going to, get over very easily. What are the answers to it? Well, I think the Democrats have been trying to pursue, two of the possible avenues to get around it, and whether they'll work, we'll see. But I think number one is to try to create counter institutions. You've seen a big rise, especially since 2004, in creation of places like the Center for American Progress and other liberal groups to try to create institutional pressure on the left to counterbalance the institutions that were created on the right in the 1970s. You had this problem in Washington where you had these old line institutions that try very, very hard to be nonpartisan, and even if they tilted a little bit to the left, they sort of bent over backwards not to be seen as partisan and left wing. And then you had a bunch of very aggressively ideological and quite partisan institutions at the right, and so now you've got aggressively ideological and partisan institutions on the left that are trying to counterbalance that. And the second one I think is really something you're mostly seeing with the Obama campaign, and that's to try to mobilize the public to counterbalance the insiders and the lobbies. Basically the idea is if the only thing members of Congress hear on any issue is from the people who are most affected by it, who have the most direct financial skin in the game, which is the way it usually goes, then you're going to have the kind of results you've had for a long time, and not good ones. If you can actually mobilize and organize the public, that's kind of what I think that's sort of Obama's, and Mark Schmidt's phrase is his theory of change, is a way of, getting, 1 million donors and people who are linked online and offline who can be organized in this way. So, those are the two changes the Democrats are trying to bring about, and whether it'll work or whether they'll even win, I guess we'll have to see.
Thank you very much. David, do you want to comment on anything Jonathan said before we open it up to the...
Let me comment on, let me make just two comments. I don't disagree with Jonathan that there has been a slight shift to the left on some political issues, and I note some of those things in the book that I just wrote. It would be, one would be unwise, I think, to overstate how strong that is. It shows up most in the area of health care. There are some individual items that because the questions are only asked once or twice, it's hard to make a general statement about. So, for example, there were a couple of polls in 2004 and 5 that found a sudden spurt of interest in the issue of inequality. Was that a real thing, or was that an artifact of the way polls are done? I don't know. Let me, though, just take up the last point that Jonathan mentioned, which is if the idea of the Obama campaign is that the Obama presidency will achieve its goals through a constant mobilization of citizen involvement at a very high level. That strikes me as an unpromising approach to government because it can't be done. And I do think Jonathan is right that that's what the Obama campaign has in mind, and that's, I think, the meaning of that otherwise cryptic remark of Michelle Obama's about how Barack will not allow you to retreat into your cynicism. I mean, he envisions a level of mobilization that Ronald Reagan did once. I think with the public, you get one try at that kind of thing. You don't get to do it again and again, or you else can get very rapidly a degree of political fatigue. The last bit of I don't know whether you will consider it good news or not that I can offer, is despite what the statistics are showing now about inequalities of wealth and assets, I wonder if those numbers will look the same 12, 15 months from now, if the markdown in the value of American assets continues to move and to accelerate in the way that it is going. I mean, we may discover that assets are worth an awful lot less in the United States 12 to 15 months from now than they are today, especially, by the way, if they're denominated in, say, euros rather than dollars.
Should I respond? You know, we're having an argument about data between two people who don't have any data in front of them. So
I was just peeking in my computer, actually.
And Cliff Duke just left.
It's of limited value, and I would never, go so far as to prepare to bring data for some, I would do it if I was writing an article, but just to, show up and have an argument, I would just kind of talk out of my behind. So, but I did do the research for my book, and again, on questions like big questions about like the role of government, bigger versus smaller government. You've seen, and it precedes the Bush administration. They 9/11 kind of masked it, but you've seen a real sharp liberal shift. I think with Obama, I think there's two parts. Real briefly, I think his theory is an inside game and an outside game. And the inside game is, I think he has a lot of mostly justified faith in his ability to talk with people, to reason with them, to hear their concerns, to find consensus and shared grounds. Whether that's going to work in as polarized an atmosphere as Washington, we'll have to see. But that's kind of the inside game. I think he really does believe in his talents there, and I mean I think he has a lot of reason to think he's better than Hillary Clinton at that. And then again, I think there's the outside game, and you're right. It's untried. It's untried. You had some of this in the '60s. You had the sort of Nader movement and the rise of those movements, and they really were a pretty effective pressure on Congress for several years. I mean, there was a time in the late '60s and early '70s when Congress was afraid of getting on Ralph Nader's bad side because all these Nader groups were going to rise up and write letters and speak out, and that sort of disappeared and went away. And of course, then you had K Street, which was much more powerful and much stronger. And that sort of came out of almost nowhere in the 1970s. And I sort of talk about this in the book. But while I would not want to hold the sort of Nader movement as a model, I think this idea of mobilizing citizens has some possibilities.
Okay, let's open it up. Before we do, I think I just want to comment that I think we have a history of mobilizing opposition. So that in '93, the opposition to the Clinton healthcare plan was mobilized, and there was no mobilized force it had no constituency, so there was no mobilized force to defend it. And so I think the Obama insight is you got to have something there. Probably can't have it all the time. Yes, please identify yourself, and whatever you say, make sure it can reasonably end in a question mark.
Al Milliken, Washington Independent Writers. Is Mike Huckabee staying in the Republican presidential race making any difference for the future of the Republican Party? And has Ron Paul made any difference for the future of the Republican Party?
Yeah, I would say yes to both. Mike Huckabee, I think it's pretty clear what he's planning to do. He wants to impress on the public mind the idea that he came second in 2008. In the Democratic Party, we call people who come second losers. But in the Republican Party, we call people coming second the next nominee. And so that's a very important thing to leave behind. He's working with it. And if the Republicans lose the presidency in 2008, one would guess the next contest will be a contest of whoever came in second, whether that is perceived to be Romney or Huckabee, versus whoever is chosen as John McCain's running mate. So it's a big prize to stamp that on the public mind. Ron Paul, I mean, he's tapped into something real. He raised a lot of money, certainly, and he mobilized a lot of energy. How much of that is the floating alienated voter who went to Ralph Nader in 2000 and went to Pat Buchanan in 1992 and is in many ways not an ideological person, but just a fairly disconnected and alienated person? I don't know how much of it is a coherent movement. I don't know. I think we do know that there are about 2% of the country, or a little less, are serious libertarians, and that's probably a ceiling. So that part of the Ron Paul message, I don't know, has a big future. But alienation, doubt, and certainly the kind of technological techniques he tapped into on an even bigger scale, or sorry, not on an even more dramatic scale than Howard Dean. Those things have a future.
Let me play off that last point, because I think it's actually, you've got an interesting dynamic between this election and the next election, because I think the Republicans have made the right decision, at least in terms of electability, in terms of who to elect, in terms who to nominate. John McCain is their strongest candidate by far. And I think the Democrats are about to make the right decision with Obama, who's just a much more popular and talented politician than Hillary Clinton. But whoever loses is going to decide that they made the wrong decision and go back. So if Obama loses, Hillary Clinton will say, see, I was right, we needed the tested, experienced, so we need to nominate me and my 50% disapproval ratings in 2008, and there's a good chance they'll lose. Whereas if the Democrats win, the Republicans will say, see, we sold out to the center, we abandoned our true beliefs, we need to nominate Mitt Romney or someone who will never deviate, and then they'll lose. So it's almost as if, whoever wins this election has a real strong leg up on the next one, because the next party is going to psych itself out.
Actually, I know we want to get. Let me just say one thing. That I think is a really important point. I can speak more to Republicans than Democrats, but it really is true that parties that lose often have a fundamentalist temptation. So 1964 follows 1960, 1972 follows 1968. And I call this the English tourist approach to politics, which is if people aren't understanding what you're saying, what you must do is say it again, only louder and slower. So that's good. And one of the things that I think is going to be really important political work for people like me inside the Republican Party is to say, if we do lose, to avoid the temptation to look for a Barry Goldwater, to say we have to be reaffirm all the things that got us into trouble. We need to do even more of them.
Of course, in my view, John McCain is Barry Goldwater in addition to holding his seat. But other questions, especially people who haven't asked a question yet. Okay, turn to people who have asked questions.
Hey, thank you, Doctor. Some of what you're saying is like, I hate to push somebody else's book, but Matt Bai wrote a really good book called Billionaires and Bloggers, The Fight Over the Democratic Soul. And I think the billionaires are the establishment party, the secret group, and the bloggers are the daily cost types. And I think very much Obama represents the blogger types, and the billionaires represent Hillary in this way. But a very interesting trend, I think, in the bloggers is a libertarian trend, and I'm seeing it in the immigration issue. And the Daily Kos guy, Marcus, what's his name? He says that he's a libertarian. And I know from California that there's a lot of liberal libertarians. And Marcus says his next book's going to be about democratic libertarians. And I wonder if you're seeing that. I'm seeing that in the immigration issue, that there's a real libertarian trend in that.
Yeah, he's not a libertarian. He says that, but he's he's a liberal.
He's a liberal libertarian.
Yeah, I think there's some people who like the idea of the libertarian label for various reasons, but when they describe their views, they're not even close to libertarian.
Maybe he could be given what libertarian is, a libertarian. I mean, just put in a lot more syllables, and you can then have a whole new word.
Exactly.
Which we did a session with Brink Lindsay, who coined that phrase from the Cato Institute.
We coined that for him. I have to say the liberal.
Oh, all right. Well, he's stuck with it. He embraces it proudly, so that's fine. Now, one thing I'll say that's interesting about Obama, he's actually really kept his distance from the bloggers in an interesting way. He's not sort of let himself become their guy the way Ned Lamont did in Connecticut. He's kind of played it a little bit close to his chest in a way that I actually find very interesting.
It should connect. One of the surveys I did 97% of Americans have never looked at a political blog.
Yes.
You know, I have been struck by the entire morning and afternoon where there seems to be this, the conversation deals with the current construct as politics as they are, without an admission, I think, of participants, panelists, that perhaps the politics really are shifting. That in fact, what Obama really suggests is a true shift, not just in the way that things are done completely. And listening to this particular panel, I'm not hearing even an imagining that there might be a different way to play the political game after 2008. I mean, is it just that we don't think that it's possible, or do you think that there obstacles are there that would prevent the game from shifting entirely to an almost new sense?
Well, I may not or must not have expressed myself well, because I am. That's been something I am very convinced of, is that we are at the in the period from 94 to 2008, we've been at the end of a political cycle that really started in the 1960s. We're at the end of the Nixon-Reagan political era, and so something new is coming. Now, where I may disappoint you is I don't think it's the celestial choirs that Hillary Clinton talked about. That there are things that are also enduring, but in the United States, you'll only have two political parties, and it's extremely difficult to start a new party, probably impossible, because you have to start it in 50 states. So any new political tendency has to work itself through the old party structure. And that takes a long time, because not only do new people have to come into a political party, but as they change the party, they also end up pushing out other people who were there before them. So as the Republican Party became a more ideologically conservative party in the 60s and 70s, as it gained votes from ethnic Catholics in northeastern cities and Midwestern cities, as it gained the votes of white Southerners, it also ended up extruding a lot of people in places like Vermont and upstate New York who had always been traditional Republicans. So those cycles are slow, and I think we're on the verge of one now that is going to dramatically rearrange what the party structure looks like. Will it dramatically rearrange the ability of a president to summon the attention of the public to support the president's legislative program? That is a very different question. Ronald Reagan was able to do it once in 1981. George Bush, I think, was basically able to do it once with Iraq. Bill Clinton tried to do it once with health care and failed. But no, I don't know that anyone's ever done it twice.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, no one's going to come in and sweep everything away that was there before and enact change in the totality of the way their supporters would like them to. Even Franklin Roosevelt's, you're talking about a long record of failures mixed with successes and compromises that, in the totality of it was pretty sweeping. But, when you look at it at the small level, he didn't just come in and roll over everybody and do what he wanted. He was going this way and that. And Roosevelt, of course, is the most dramatic example that you could find. So I'm pretty hopeful about what, Obama could do. And I think that was what your reference was. But, it'll still be incremental. There'll still be a lot of failures. There'll be a lot of compromises, even if it works the way it's supposed to.
I mean, I think my argument on the opening panel was nothing, it's not going to go back to the way it used to be, and just at the most mundane level, a Democratic president with a Democratic congressional majority that does not depend on support from Southern conservatives is not something we've ever seen before. Yes.
As a political independent, I'd like you to speak a little more about political independence. They didn't get much love earlier in the day, sort of dismissed as, they're actually all Democratic leaners or Republican leaners, and I acknowledge there's a lot of those. But there are people who are genuine independents, and how might they play a role in the future of the parties?
Yeah, I actually concur with it. I am always bugged by these charts that group Democratic leaners in with Democrats and Republicans. This is all like footnotes to that famous memo that Matthew Dowd sent to Karl Rove, and I think that was that captured a particular moment and then turned that into an enduring truth. Here, the core of truth is, as you get a better informed electorate, as the parties become better at their jobs, you're going to, I think it is natural that you see less of the extreme volatility that you saw, say, that took us from 60% for Lyndon Johnson in 1964 to 60% for Richard Nixon in 1972. Somebody's just not, the voters are not, if that many voters are swinging like that, either they're not paying attention or the parties aren't doing a good job of figuring out where the voters are. So as we all get better, we're going to see less volatility of that extreme kind. But I agree with you. Voters, I mean, you think about the people you know, maybe not the people you know in Washington, but the people you know anywhere else. They will vote for candidates they don't agree with if they are able to come up with a kind of personal connection. I mean, that was certainly true for Ronald Reagan. The country was never as conservative as he was. If Barack Obama emerges, that will be true for him. The country will be nowhere near as liberal as Barack Obama is. But there is somehow an ability to capture. And I think it would be a great aid to understanding if, when we did those charts, at least we used different colors or something for Democrats and Democratic leaders.
Let's have one last question. Yes.
I just wonder, is it possible to have an independent party with a generic value like integrity, honesty, and have their sub-value as variables? It seems to me very natural, you know. You don't feel you need to associate with any party, but you want to elect somebody who is certain value. But the sub-value, how do you interpret it? The tax policy, those things variable depends on the time and how they execute it.
Well, I would just say briefly, I don't think it's possible. I think it's in the United States, it's easier to take over a party than it is to start a party.
And on that note of sad cynicism, thank you all for coming. I want to also thank David McNamee on our staff, who's done a wonderful job of getting most of this together, and the communication staff, Liz Wu, and others as well.